beginning with the next session on Shakespeare in India in about 20 minutes from now. Until then, there is a book signing session by the Oxford Bookstore Corner with the panel on A New Gaze, Change and the Northeast of India, which you can go and be a part of. I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors for AKLF 2019, our institutional partners, Oxford University Press, the Australian Council for Arts, the Consulate General of Italy, Calcutta Heritage Collective and the Creative Arts, as well as the Teacher Center. Our session partners, Khwaja Ahmad Abbas Memorial Trust, Zuban and Sasakawa Peace Foundation, as well as the India Foundation for the Arts. Our tea partner, Thai Food Tea, our radio partner, 91.9 Friends FM. Our food partner, Food for You, quick food partners, Wow Momo and Gupta Brothers Confectionaries, as well as Subway. While you're waiting, you can go ahead and treat yourself to some refreshments at the food stalls that we have over here. And we will be beginning with the next session on Desi Shakespeare at 5:20. Thank you. Say that we are all set to commence with the next session for this evening. Desi Shakespeare, which will include Jonathan Gill Harris, who happens to be an academic, writer, and a dedicated follower of Hindi cinema, and also a prominent Shakespeare scholar who has authored 6 books on the drama and culture of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Mr. Harris will be in conversation with Dr. Ananda, who is an academic and theatre critic. He's a professor of English and coordinator for Rabindranath Tagore Studies Center at Jadavpur University, Kolkata, and also heads the Writers' Workshop. Dr. Lal is a director of theatre and also a theatre critic with the Telegraph newspaper. We are also being joined by Mr. Mahesh Dattani, who is a playwright, director, and actor. His plays are well known for their socio-political point of view and their treatment of gender and social relations. One of his most acclaimed works, Final Solutions, made him the first Indian playwright to win the Sahitya Academy Award back in 1998. The session will be moderated by Mr. Debanjan Chakrabarti, a director, British Council East and Northeast India, who has been a journalist and taught English literature at Vishwabharati University in Shantiniketan and at the University of Reading. For further information about our panelists, please do visit our website www.aklf.in. I shall now hand over the proceedings to Mr. Chakrabarti.
Hello. Hi everyone, and thank you for being here on a very interesting day in Kolkata. And I'm really impressed with the turnout. And
for the Pori Barton or for this?
I mean, it's all, words. I mean, you can swap words for anything. It's my great pleasure to be with a panel, where, chairing a panel with all of whom, panelists with all of whom I've had great academic contacts and professional contacts. Anandolal, there was a little bit of a slightly dated CV of yours was read out. You have retired from teaching English at Shakespeare, and you now review for the Times of India, not the Telegraph. So that's a little bit of factual correction. Ananda taught me in Jadavpur. Mahesh, I have worked with in my first stint with the British Council when you were involved with the fabulous school drama competition we used to run. So thank you, Mahesh, for coming back to Kolkata. And Jonathan, you and I have known each other in our professional capacities through Ashoka University, and we work quite closely with the university. This is a very interesting day. Again, I mean, that context of the Grand Alliance, or whatever it is in some ways very Shakespearean, and I think we will touch upon it at some point of time. And I'm just reminded of the fact that when I was being taught Shakespeare, often line by line by line, because that's what Professor Shupriya Chaudhary, Anandolal, and Shopan Chakraborty, Shukanto Chaudhary, they taught us to come to grips with Shakespeare's English, which is almost a foreign language, a non-English language in some ways. And one of the things I still distinctly remember, I don't know, Ananda, you probably told us, or was it Shopanda? I don't exactly remember. But to get a grip on Shakespeare, we were encouraged to look at it as something that Salim Javed would have written in his time. So that parallel somehow stuck with me. And later on, when I went to Reading to pursue my PhD, I was very fortunate to have shared an office space with Professor Andrew Gurr, who, like you, is from New Zealand. And he was then the academic director of the Globe Theatre in London. And we talked a lot about the other S, Sachin, because he was a massive cricket fan. So, and we talked a little bit about Shakespeare too. So that is like a little bit of a context setting. And I'm also aware of this wonderful venue and the location. So we are in a lawn, and there's Max Muller Bhavan and Alliance Francaise just around us. And I think it was Heinrich Heine who said Shakespeare was a German, is a German. So with that kind of rather rambling context setting, I would like to come to Ananda first. We'll go in alphabetical order. So Ananda, my question to you is, how old is this business of Desi Shakespeare?
Actually, a lot of people don't know this, but it is in fact very, very old. Now, it also depends on how you define Desi, because the British, of course, brought Shakespeare here. And they did this in the 18th century. A lot of Indians don't know that. And of course, at the beginning, they were performing Shakespeare for themselves. And those of you who might have seen the Shakespeare on Calcutta stage checklist that we brought out might remember that the first entry that we had was from 1780, a performance of Othello, for which a reviewer wrote that Desdemona was performed by a gentleman of doubtful gender. Now, if that is not contemporary, of course, there was there must have been gossip in that very close circle of Englishmen and women, not so many women, ladies at that time. But that was the beginning, and that set the stage. Again, many Indians are not aware of the fact that in Calcutta, Shakespeare was being taught in schools and colleges before Macaulay, and in fact, before a lot of England. Because Shakespeare didn't enter the formal British curriculum until a little later. And here we were in presidency, for instance. I'm not that old, but we, in terms of the community, I am from presidency. The fact that people like De Rosio were performing Shakespeare. Those names, you can just rattle them off, but we don't have enough time. Anybody who was the who's who of Calcutta, intellectuals, artists, academics, passed through a stage in the first 2 decades of their education here of performing, reading, reciting Shakespeare while studying in the classroom. And this was, of course, an English curriculum. There is no theatre arts in that sense as a formal training as yet, and in India for a long, long time ever since. Then you begin to understand that gradually, of course, we naturalized Shakespeare. And as early as, I have to talk about Calcutta because that's where it's actually beginning, as early as what was it now? Nobin Toposhini. Some of you might even know the date for that offhand, but I think it's 1860-something. Dinobandhu Mitra's play, Nobin Toposhini, because he had also been educated in this same kind of milieu that I'm talking about. He just lifted Falstaff out of Merry Wives of Windsor and placed it in an adaptation. This is an original play, but clearly already we are going in a direction where Indian Shakespeare, Desi Shakespeare is headed. Because we adapt. We do not translate. Very soon after, in 1893, well, before we get to 1893, I'll give you another example. In 1880, your very own Jyotirindranath Tagore wrote Osrumati, which is another adaptation, a take from Othello. where his version of Desdemona sings the Willow Song in Jyotirindranath's handwriting. It's written Italian Jijit. Now, those of you who know classical music will understand that Jijit is the Bangla for Rag Jinjhoti. Italian Jinjhoti, if that's not Masala Shakespeare, I don't know what is. That is Jyotirindranath. And that's where things proceed to carry on. In 1893, an exception to the case, Girish Chandra Ghosh, major admirer of Shakespeare, decides that he's going to do Macbeth in the authentic, genuine style. So he imports English costumes, decor. We have all these accounts. And you have in North Calcutta the professional Bangla stage over there. You have Macbeth and the other Scots people wearing kilts and coming along. And obviously the Bengali audience is completely discombobulated, right? I mean, what is going on over here? The entire production bombed. It was such a disaster that Girish Chandra and everybody else in definitely Bangla theatre, but probably there were others who learned from it as well, that this is clearly not the way to succeed in performing Shakespeare over here. You do not translate, you adapt. So therein lies the background basically to the question that you... But of course, already, I mean, we were talking about Calcutta, but just let me just put in another anecdote which a lot of you will not know from Bombay. In the 1870s, there was a Shakespeare Natak Mandali in Bombay. Okay, so not only has the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre not been around, or not forget the Royal Shakespeare Company, India invented companies named after Shakespeare. Let's take that credit too. So the Parsi theatre is actually the progenitor of Bollywood. So what you get by way of Masala Shakespeare later on screen has its precedence in Parsi theatre of Bombay. All right. Satisfied?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful setting of the context. And now I would like to come to Jonathan. Jonathan, this book, Masala Shakespeare, if I can just hold it up for the audience. This is an absolutely fantastic book that has just come out, published by AKLF, Masala Shakespeare, and how a Firangi writer became Indian. And it's a real page turner. So thank you, Jonathan, for this wonderful book. And you dwell on the in-betweenness of genres that Shakespeare plays around with, and then extend it to Bollywood films. But also, it's quite a political book in some ways. You are almost setting up the secular against the political, art against religion. So I think I hope you will touch upon this a little bit. But let me ask you, set you off with this question, that is Masala Shakespeare necessarily Desi?
Yeah, that's Masala. Is Masala Shakespeare necessarily Desi? Well, yes and no. Because one of my arguments in this book is that Shakespeare always was Masala. The word Masala may not have existed, but Shakespeare was deeply invested, or rather, let me qualify that slightly. Shakespeare's theatre culture was deeply invested in an idea that is at the heart of the idea of Masala, which is mixture and impurity. And I think it's important for us to just sort of pause and take that in for a bit, because Shakespeare has, thanks to 400 years of his canonization in the English curriculum and several hundred years of colonialism, Shakespeare's come to be associated with high art and with various ideals of purity, whether it's purity of language, purity of genre. Shakespeare's regarded as an exponent of comedy on the one hand and tragedy on the other, as if they belong to completely different universes. Yet Shakespeare and his contemporaries were writing for a mixed audience. As you probably know, at Shakespeare's Globe, workers would pay just 1 penny to enter the pit. They'd pay an extra penny, or not workers, but slightly richer people would pay an extra penny to sit in the balconies. And people would pay a small fortune to sit on stage if they could afford it. The audience varied from rich to poor. It varied also in terms of gender and even in terms of culture. It varied in terms of language, and this is something that, that I think needs to be understood very carefully. I like what you reported about Ananda saying that to understand Shakespeare's language, you need to understand that he was doing something along the lines of what Salim Javed did. Salim Javed, like most Bollywood writers, were writing for a mixed audience, mixed in terms of class, in terms of religious community, but also mixed in terms of language. As did Shakespeare. He didn't, and this sounds vaguely scandalous, he didn't write in English as such because English had not yet been standardized. He was writing for an audience who spoke a variety of dialects, and his plays had to somehow accommodate variations on many of them. People who came from a village background were more likely to be speaking a language that was thick with Anglo-Saxon Germanic terms. People from a certain higher class might have had a little bit more French in their dialect. People who came from a very religious background, although Catholicism was at the time Shakespeare was writing no longer the state religion, many people still recalled the liturgy being performed in Latin. They had Latin at their fingertips. Shakespeare manages to keep swerving between all these languages, as did many of his contemporary playwrights. And from that point of view, Shakespeare was actually very Indian. One of the most charming things about India, in my experience, is that people do not stay in one linguistic track. How many times have you been in a conversation that has started in one language, but has ended up swerving from English into Bengali or English into Bengali into Hindi, because the thought needs to be finished in another language? When Shakespeare coins the word dauntless, arguably the first instance of the word dauntless is in his play Macbeth. He's combining a French word, daunt, with an Anglo-Saxon suffix. And that's just one example of the way in which he is working linguistically with a kitchery that is mirrored at the level of genre. No tragedy, he writes, is completely tragic. There are always comic elements. There are clowns in his tragedies, just as his comedies involve tragic elements. So there's a deep commitment to mixture at odds with what were the prevailing ideals of art as laid down by Aristotle and classical poetics. This was instead a poetics of mixture. And from that point of view, Shakespeare was always masala.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think that really is quite pertinent to the current context as well, where we are almost battling with ideas of purity, of religion, of faith, of expressing ourselves, of identities. Purity of identities is such a contested term, not just in India, but across the world, I think in major democracies. And I think it is a kind of crisis that we are witnessing in a post-truth world, as it were. I think I'll come back to some of the ideas that you posted there. I would like to come back to you with a question on whether the idea of India in that sense is essentially Shakespearean in a metaphoric way. You touched upon that. And I would like, again, referring to your book, I would like to come back to the fact that why are history plays less masala-fied or adapted, especially in India, given the political churn that we have witnessed since 1947. Mahesh, if I can come to you, you are sort of, as a writer, as an actor, and a director. How would you consider your encounters with Shakespeare in your various avatars necessarily Desi?
Absolutely. I think when I was first introduced to Shakespeare, like many of us in school, in this sanitized sort of environment where we were told about the pentameter and the history of of England as seen through Shakespeare's plays and things. I hated Shakespeare. I think that to a lot of young people, I think the worst thing one can do is teach Shakespeare in school. Because it sort of alienates you right from the beginning. But the minute had the teachers, of course, I think that happens more now, had the teachers just asked us to perform those roles, we would have discovered the musicality rather than being told what this rhythm is in the text. It would have been far more interesting for us to discover it. Only later, when I began my theatre company in Bangalore, I had the good fortune of interacting with an English theatre director, Michael Walling. And we were looking at collaborations, and he said he'd love to come to India and direct a play. And I said, which one would you like to do? And he said, The Tempest. And I said, oh, no, not Shakespeare. It's people don't like Shakespeare, and it's boring. And, I just thought and I did, I wasn't very familiar with The Tempest then. I did read it, and I said, I really can't understand this. But when he came down, we went through a kind of character analysis more than line analysis. And suddenly ideas began to flow. We could see connections between Prospero and Brahmanism, and how Caliban then became this subaltern slave and indigenous person. And Ariel had overtones of Krishna and spirituality, and how the Brahmin sort of appropriates spirituality, and how the Brahmin then appropriates land and culture from the indigenous person. Now it sounds very controversial. It doesn't sound boring at all, does it? Right? So that was an eye-opener to me, and I was amazed at how much I could provide dramaturgy just because he evoked this response in me. And that's when I realized that not only am I Desi, but Shakespeare's Desi as well. So that definitely was the beginning of a love affair. Although I didn't do too much Shakespeare, just recently, 2 years ago, I was asked to direct the annual graduate production of the Madhya Pradesh Drama School. And again, I told them I'd love to do Shakespeare. And again, there was this groan and said, no, let's not, let's do something modern. And we're tired of doing something classic, because they've just done a classic play, an adaptation of a Sanskrit classic. So I said, no, let's have fun with this. And they were on a field trip to the Chhattisgarh region, and were studying tribal cultures as part of their project. And that's when I got the idea that we'll do Midsummer Night's Dream, and we will set the lovers, and including Theseus and Hippolyta, amongst the tribal cultures. So the lovers are tribals, and the charmed forest that Shakespeare talks about became the concrete jungle that they run away to come to the city. And the city is the den of iniquity with, with people with fragile egos, and you have, couples fighting over a puppy and saying that this puppy belongs to me, and they're on the verge of divorce because of it, and they have their underlings and minions and servants, and each one fighting for their master or mistress's cause. And you won't believe it, we did not have to change a single plot line in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. It all just fitted in beautifully. So you could see, I think it's the genius of Shakespeare, and of course it's the genius of indigenous cultures, and I don't think the two are very different. So when you talk about Shakespeare being masala, I would like to believe that Shakespeare is human first, and the concept of purity, which is what we're talking about, is inhuman in that sense, right? So when we're talking about masala and we're talking about mixture and transformation, it is very, very much connected to the human condition. There is no such thing as purity. That's the inhumanity of culture and civilization, and the masala is the humanity of Shakespeare, which lives in all of us.
Thanks, Mesh. And I think that's a wonderful sort of way of putting this dichotomy that we are facing, I think, as a civilization. Ananda, if I might come back to you with something that Mahesh said just now about teaching of Shakespeare, how teaching of Shakespeare as a text sometimes takes the joy out of this. And you mentioned that Shakespeare was taught first as a text in India. I mean, it was being taught in schools even before Macaulay enters the scene. I would like you to respond to that with reference to two of the plays. Some of us, certainly, many of us in the audience may have been witness to. One is, of course, the Tim Supple's Midsummer's Night's Dream. You were the dramaturge for that. And that had a smattering of Indian languages. Some would call it Masala Shakespeare or Desi Shakespeare. That's one text I would like you to refer to. And the other was the wonderful production of Merchant of Venice, in which Sohini then played Shylock. Would you... are these instances of Desi Shakespeare, and how does that impact the pedagogy, Shakespearean pedagogy in schools, colleges, and universities in India?
Thank you, Debanjan. Those are true. I mean, maybe in a different definition of Desi, because Supple's Dream, of course, was a British Council project. From the beginning, without the British Council funding, plug, British Council, etc. No, seriously, it would not have happened. But let's face facts. Let's be honest about this. It wouldn't have happened because it required enormous funding. And because it got that funding, Supple was able to do something that most directors are unable to do, which is that, let's call him Tim actually, we know him as Tim. He moved throughout the country, India, well not just India, also Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and it was a South Asian production in which he auditioned all over the place, bringing down a number of about 300 applicants for acting roles, ultimately down to his the cast that comprises Midsummer Night's Dream, and entirely workshopped in India, in Bombay, and then Adi Shakti, the Pondicherry workplace of I'm sorry, Veenapani Chawla. Thanks, Mahesh. Why is that? Because, I mean, Veenapani is such an influence on me too, in terms of, and just suddenly the name just goes away just because she's left us, you know, that shouldn't happen. The whole thing was, like Gil was saying, it was a mixture of languages whereby you had English. It's not just a smattering. You had the same text translated into Malayalam, Tamil, Bangla, Hindi, a total of actually 7 languages, including English. And there was no attempt, therefore, to bring it down to one monolingual text. So I don't think the production suffered in getting across to the audience. just because the actors were so good at conveying, as I always think as a theatre director, you can get across even despite the handicap of language. If I see a Russian Chekhov, if it's great, I will still enjoy the Chekhov play because of the power of the performances. So I think he was able to do that well, and to an extent that I've written about this, many Indian directors were not able to do, had not done before, which is to unite India through this half a dozen languages on one stage and using one text and getting across not just to India, but then they took it worldwide. So it was a kind of international hit on its own terms. So that was some degree of desification, if you wish. Not just that, in terms of performance, he actually used the inherent training and traits of members of the cast, whether that was acrobatics, circus acrobatics, whether that was a particularly local traditional form, he brought those in to the production as well. Merchant of Venice is one of my productions which I directed annually at JU. And I was very happy with that production because, of course, we had not just Sohini Sengupta as Shylock. That was her first major role, actually, in her career. She was a JU student. But also 3 or 4 other brilliant performers. You cannot just rely on one good actor. And because of the communal riots that had taken place during the previous year, this was in 1996-7 that I'm talking about, I was very concerned, and of course I always, as you know, Debanjan, I always try to bring these issues alive in the classroom. We used a particular sartorial style so that Shylock could be recognizably of a minority community in India. So it wasn't just that Shylock was a woman. Sohini did not act Shylock as a man. Shylock was Madam Shylock, not Shylock. Shylock, 2 syllables. So she, however, was a woman, so she was being doubly, obviously, targeted. And she belonged visibly, without any changes in dialogue, visibly and in terms of mannerisms, to a minority community. So I think that particular message got across very clearly. There were the majority community, which was partying all the time to at that time, the Macarena, had some decidedly fundamentalist design elements in the stage design. So a certain color was constantly there in front of the audience. And this was 96, 97. And the way that Shylock is forcibly converted towards the end, we used that in a certain way that it could express our own context too.
If I could come to you, Jonathan, now, with that question that when we look at Masala Shakespeare and the history of and the history and practice of adapting Shakespeare in India, in films, is there a kind of blindness towards the history plays of Shakespeare? Because I think what Ananda was referring to, what Mahesh was referring to, suggests that the politics of India is very fertile for Shakespearean historical play adaptations, and there's hardly any sort of history, any of the histories being adapted into Bollywood or any of the major sort of as a theatre production. I don't remember one. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, it's a very good question. I'm not sure I have a straightforward answer to it. It's interesting that there's been a long engagement in Bombay cinema with Shakespeare, and as Ananda pointed out, it dates back to the Parsi theatre's love affair with Shakespeare. And interestingly, the Parsi theatre did engage over and over again with the history plays. To the best of our knowledge, there are something like 80 Parsi theatre adaptations from the 19th century, early 20th century of Shakespeare, and a number of them are of histories. The very first Hindi, in quote marks, talkie adaptation of Shakespeare was a version of a Parsi theatre Hamlet called Khoon Ka Khoon, Blood for Blood. Directed by Saurabh Modi from the Parsi theatre. But his second attempt to bite the Shakespeare cherry was an Urdu film called Said-e-Havas, Lust Story. And it was, interestingly enough, an adaptation of King John, one of Shakespeare's less well-known history plays. Since then, there's been very little that one can point to. Arguably, Vishal Bhardwaj's non-Shakespeare film, what's it called? It's the one set in Haryana with Imran Khan. It involves a lot of quotations from Hamlet, but Pankaj Kapoor plays a recognizably Falstaff character. I think the big challenge the history plays present for Indian adaptations is how absolutely situated they seem to be in their English time and place. Right. So they're perhaps a little bit less obviously mobile than a tragedy like Romeo and Juliet, even though it's set in Verona. There's something about the tale of lovers from divided houses, from divided communities, that immediately speaks to an Indian audience. And that's why it's arguable that Bollywood couldn't exist without Romeo and Juliet. There are explicit adaptations like Golion Ki Ras Leela, Ram Leela, or Bengali adaptations like Aparna Sen's Arshinagar. But then there are all these other sort of much more indirect takes on Romeo and Juliet, like Ishaqzadeh. Even a film like Mughal-e-Azam has a lot of Romeo and Juliet in it. I imagine one day, because Hindi Shakespeare seems to be the rage, someone is going to discover that there is material in the history plays that can be looted and converted into a profit at the box office. But for now, it seems like the comedies and the tragedies speak more in the Indian context.
Mahesh, would you like to sort of comment on that line of conversation on some over-representation of some of the plays, some of being less represented?
Well, I think as a culture, what we can relate to is probably the heightened drama and the domestic. It's, I think, either heightened or domestic, or both, which relate to us. But I would like to surmise, and mind you, I'm not an expert on Shakespeare, I feel that maybe the history dramas, because at the heart of all his dramas is about decadence, it is about corruption and the downfall, right? I think it may be too close to the truth to really depict them historically, because you could see the parallels between our politicians immediately, and I think that's why commercial cinema would would not attempt something like that.
Can I just underline what Mahesh said? One of the very best adaptations of Shakespeare I've seen was a student theatre production by Zakir Hussain College by a bunch of predominantly Muslim students. It was an adaptation of Richard III called Rana, and it was set in North India in the 19th century. And its main character, like Richard III, was a corrupt Machiavel who, through force of personality, through charismatic speeches, manages to bend people to his will. It was clear that these students, even though they had set it in 19th century India, were thinking about the emergence of another strong man over the last few years from another part of, well, more western than northern India. You could see why film producers would be both intrigued by but would run away screaming from this kind of adaptation. But I think Mahesh is absolutely right that the history plays are potentially too close to home for rather nervous film producers whose livelihood depends often on placating authority rather than questioning it explicitly to adapt the history plays in the Indian context.
Ananda, would you like to respond to the history dilemma?
Well, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure about that, because if that were the case, then theatre would certainly have done more history plays. But they haven't in India. Again, it's more or less the same in terms of tragedies and comedies, yes, but histories on stage too have not been that. So I would probably doubt whether that particular point is.
Maybe true of cinema.
Maybe it is true of cinema, absolutely. But then that's not the only thing. It's probably going back to what you were saying before, is that it's too situated in England as a history for us to be able to adapt so much of the text. Although Parsi theatre used to do that a lot. Parsi theatre used to mix, used to choose 3 Shakespeare plays, this scene from that one, another scene from another, and put them all together, and you got a khichdi. And that worked. So why not? Which brings me to the question, Gil. I think there's a lot of Indian literature predating the British, where Romeo and Juliet also, in terms of doomed lovers, for instance, the entire Persian Dastan tradition, it's so full of it. So I think it's just feeding into that long tradition that pre-exists from before Shakespeare.
But to that extent, isn't it, again, relates to how Shakespeare was sourcing his own content and materials in a very masala-fied tradition in that sense. In terms of languages, in terms of genres, it was basically ransacking classical and whatever was available in the market. So the question originally was for you.
Well, we're so conditioned to think of Shakespeare as this genius like no other, who gifted to the world the contents of his precocious brain. Shakespeare was not an author in the modern sense. He didn't produce original stories that were intellectually his copyright. He was a kabadiwala. He found everywhere he went stories that he could take, adapt, twist, in much the same way, by the way, Bollywood works nowadays. That's why I'm always a little bit puzzled by the response of film reviewers to the latest Bollywood masala film, when they say, well, this story isn't original. That kind of misses the point. People, when they go to see entertainments, aren't often looking for an original story. I think the best analogy for the kind of writer Shakespeare was and the kind of entertainment industry he came from is not intellectual property, but cooking, which is very appropriate for masala. Shakespeare was a chef. Now, when we go to a restaurant, we want a recipe that we know already. We don't want something completely new that we've never heard of. We want something familiar, but we want something familiar in a way that is going to startle and please our palate. And the best chefs are ones who take familiar recipes and add something new, add masala to them. Shakespeare was extraordinarily good at this, and this is one of the reasons why, of his 30-plus plays, nearly all of them are stories that he stole from elsewhere. So I think this is another way in which we can sort of understand what it means for Shakespeare to be Desi. Perhaps ideas of authorship in Shakespeare's time and ideas of authorship in the Parsi theatre in Bollywood have much more in common than the idea of the isolated genius author gifting to us the cream of his intellectual accomplishment. Shakespeare was much more collaborative, much more plagiaristic than we have been conditioned to believe him to be.
Thanks very much for suggesting that Shakespeare was sort of early modern Heston Blumenthal. And I'd like to go out to the audience in a minute, but I would like to put one final question for the panelists and request them to respond to this, that we're talking of Shakespeare, Desi Shakespeare entirely in the performing traditions of, film and theatre. But what about Shakespearean adaptation in other non-performative genres such as novels? Where is the Indian A Thousand Acres, for instance?
Let me plug Preeti Taneja's recent book, We That Are Young, which is an absolutely brilliant adaptation of, or conversation with King Lear in the context of Delhi, Punjab, Kashmir, and the rise of fundamentalism in the wake of the Anna Hazare anti-corruption movements that seem to have given birth to all sorts of hideous spawn across a political spectrum. I would look not just to literature, though. The influence, I wouldn't even call it the influence of Shakespeare. It's more the morphing, the mutation of Shakespeare into other spheres. A certain chief minister from a certain populous state, for instance, has made Romeo, or rather anti-Romeo, a character that we've become obsessed with. The canard of love jihad, the idea that people might cross communal boundaries, has been deodorized a little bit, or rather the perception that one is attacking Muslims has been deodorized through the canard of the anti-Romeo squad, seeking to protect Juliets from predatory Romeos, who often turn out to be, at least in the imaginations of those who run the anti-Romeo squads, Muslims who want to become involved with Hindu women. So I think it's interesting to think also about how Shakespeare is being used and misused in such situations to assert certain fantasies of Shuddha, of lineage, of communal purity.
I really do believe Shakespeare was a genius. Again, going back to the classic line, I forget which writer said this, but a bad writer plagiarizes, a good writer steals, right? He stole, yes. To me, from what little I've explored of Shakespeare, I think his genius lies in his plasticity, that he's incredibly plastic. So that is the reason why you can add masala. He's like a plate of wet noodles. You know, you make of it. You could throw in a stir fry, or you can add a dash of soya sauce and a dollop of chili in it and make what you want of it. And I think that requires true genius to be able to get out of this rigid, oh, I am a genius and this is my intellectual take on humanity. Requires true wisdom, true alchemy, if you want to call it. And in that sense, in the impurity lies the purity. So I think it's these polarities and contradictions that make him a genius. That's why I think it's not about Desifying Shakespeare, but it's recognizing Shakespeare in our Desiness. Yes.
No. I don't have anything further to.
We'll now go out for questions to the audience. There's a hand up right there. Can you tell us who you are and then put a question?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I am Arkuraj Maite. I am from Adamas University. And presently, I'm doing Masters in English, second year. So my question is to Sir Ananda Lal. So my actual question is how Shakespeare has been included in the present curriculum of the academics, and how is it how the present plays and the texts that are being created, and how the editions vary from the classics, and how what is Shakespeare has been portrayed in the texts were actually portrayed in drama, or what is the actual dilemma regarding Shakespeare? Is post-colonial Shakespeare more interesting rather than the classics? So I just want to know the thing.
I hope to dear God that's not a question that your tutor has put to you for your next tutorial, but
No, no, there is
yeah.
far too many questions
too
over
many,
here.
too many house, yes.
There are lots of questions in your one question.
The whole debate was which was going on. Actually, it came popping around in my head, and I couldn't decide which one
That's
to ask.
fine. That's
Sure,
fine.
sure.
think
No, I
Amrita
mean,
will respond.
obviously, these are things that you need to, in fact, bring up in class and discuss with the professors concerned, because they will tell you the answers to them. Now, why a particular play is on your syllabus and not on somebody else's syllabus is not something that we can do anything about, because these are things that are decided by the individual board of studies and the department concerned.
Definitely.
Of course, there are certain so-called great plays, the 4 great tragedies, etc., but you don't have to stick to them. The 4 great comedies, we don't have to stick to them. So that's something that I need not comment on. But I think what needs to be stated very clearly is that very often Indian students are obsessed about the text. And we have to, I think, make it very categorically put it on the table before you over here that in most cases of Shakespeare's texts, there is no one major text. In Hamlet's case, you can just look it up for yourself. It's a good question I often put to my class: will the real Hamlet please stand up? Because there's a bad quarto, there's a good quarto, there's a folio, and very often they depart. The same with Lear. Now, only in half of the plays do we actually have, for instance, Macbeth, only one text. But that doesn't mean that that one text may not be corrupt. Because there are scenes in Macbeth which actually probably came from Middleton. And the company just masalified. Because at that time, later on, presumably, Middleton was more the flavor, and therefore let's put in these 2 songs. Right.
Exactly.
So even in Girish Chandra's, that reminds me, in Girish Chandra's Macbeth, he inserted 5 songs because he had to, think of the audience. So anyway, in your printed book text, it's just the skeleton. All right? Any theatre director will tell you that that is just half the job. If you're studying that text and that alone, you don't know what Shakespeare is.
Obviously, he was a playwright before an author.
Exactly. He was a professional playwright, and he was an actor, we are told, and everything was actually fleshed out. The flesh and blood is created by the company. So you have to think in terms of the final staging of it, even where it was probably staged. For many of the plays, we actually know the location for which it might have been intended, like in Macbeth's case. It was probably first done as a command performance for a visiting dignitary, and therefore indoors, not the Globe. And that makes sense because of the darkness of Macbeth as a play. Think about it. Indoors, further, more dark, all right, rather than outdoors in the afternoon sun, where Macbeth, would it work? Of course, it's a great play. But, the point is, look at it as theater, not literature. Literature is just the skeleton.
Thank you. I'd like to take a question right at the back. I think.
Good evening.
Yeah.
I'm Gargi Ghoshal from Presidency University. So I think reading Shakespeare, performing Shakespeare has become quite a discourse internationally. But what does the panel feel about it being a Desi discourse, keeping in tune with today's session?
Can I ask you to repeat the question? I'm not sure I quite understand.
Yes, what I mean is, like Foucault said, everything is a discourse, like so is language. So reading Shakespeare or performing Shakespeare has become a discourse. So what would you like to say about it being a discourse in India?
So I don't think it's a discourse, because that is to singularize it. I think there are many discourses that have Shakespeare attached to it. Even Yogi Adityanath, when he speaks about anti-Romeo squads, is speaking a Shakespeare discourse. It's a very different one, functioning in a very different interpretive community from, say, the discourse of Tim Supple performing Shakespeare in Pondicherry in 7 different languages. What I'd like to say is that I think we can learn a lot about Shakespeare if, instead of thinking of Shakespeare as the origin and, say, Omkara or Makbul or Heder as the adaptation, which is to put Shakespeare at the origin and to treat the Indian adaptation simply as pale copies that come after. We actually reread Shakespeare through the lens of these Indian conversations with him. I certainly, as a Shakespearean, have learnt an enormous amount about Shakespeare that I would have not otherwise realized by watching Hindi cinema. I think I'm a much better reader of Shakespeare for having become an aficionado of Bollywood. So I think there's a way in which the many discourses of Shakespeare can be shaken up by decentering Shakespeare, by saying Shakespeare is not simply a genius who speaks to us from the center in Britain, but recognizing that Shakespeare is rather a recipe that has traveled through the world, has been treated over and over again in a variety of ways, and that very plasticity, elasticity, tells us something about that Shakespeare that we might not, the historical Shakespeare and his theatre culture, that we may not have otherwise understood.
Mahesh or Ananda, would you like to respond to that question on Shakespearean discourses?
Well, yeah, I just want to quote from a movie I saw about a chef. And there's this sous chef who alters a French recipe, which is about, I don't know, let's say 500 years old. I forget what the actual time was. And, you know, the expert chef says, but why do you want to change a recipe that's 500 years old? And he says, because 500 years is not enough to make the perfect recipe. So I think that's what like you rightly said, I mean, Shakespeare is not the origin, and Omkara is not the outcome or final. So, you know, who knows, 200 years down the line, we might be looking at Omkara as the original, and, you know, something else. So
that's a brilliant way of putting it. Ananda, I mean, if we could conclude the session with you. I think we have run out of time. Maybe one last question. Can I come to you there? Yeah. Can someone get this lady a mic, please? Right in the front. Would you like to come up here?
Definitely, why not? So my question is, I'm Monali, by the way. I'm from Calcutta University master's student. Does Bollywood invest in Shakespeare because it is safe? I mean, he is so popular that it is a safe writer to produce, because he will bring back money. Or rather, the director who is adopting will bring back the money, because the academia will definitely go with it. Is a good or bad production to judge, and the public will also go to see what is happening.
No. Can I come in very quickly on this? Nobody is seeing a Hindi film because it's Shakespeare. All right? Nobody. Only you and maybe me. I wouldn't too. But, you know, maybe some others there know that it's Shakespeare, and we are the ones who are going to be writing the research papers. Oh, that is there and this is not there. Why isn't that there? Come on, get out of that mindset, because Shakespeare himself, had he rewritten the play, would have dropped something and added something else. So, I mean, that's when you're buying a we're going to the box office to buy a ticket for a film, we are not really concerned, only literature students are concerned whether it's Jane Austen, right? It doesn't matter for the general public. They are watching a film, not because it's sourced from Shakespeare. No, only we can,
Right.
we have this. That's
No, thank you very much. It's a very, very interesting question. I really need to bring this session to a close because we are running out of time. The panelists are around, I think, after this session is over. May I request the audience to put their hands together for this wonderful panel where we discussed a number of things, including the competing politics of identity, the multilinguality of Shakespeare, the various sources he ransacked, the hybridity of his genius. I think that was really the sort of point that I am taking away from this session. Thank you very much, Jonathan, Mahesh, Ananda, for being here with us. And thank you to Apeejay Kolkata Literary Festival for inviting all of us to be part of this wonderful festival of ideas. Thank you very much.
My apologies for the errors in the early announcements, sir. But I think everybody here would agree on the fact that a literature festival, that too in Bengal, which has perhaps produced some truly prolific adaptations of Shakespeare, would have been incomplete without a discussion on the Bard, and especially the way in which his works have been accommodated into an Indian cultural milieu. So thank you so much, Jonathan sir, Professor Lal, Mahesh sir, and Debanjan sir for being here with us today. We'd request you to proceed to the Delegates Lounge for the media interaction session.